Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. So good evening. I'm Mary Lee Kiernan. I'm President and CEO of YWCA Greenwich. And on behalf of our board chair, Cheryl Plummer, who is with us, our board, our entire staff, we're so pleased to welcome you to this special annual event, the Coretta Scott King and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Annual Conversation. And this is a hybrid event. So we are welcoming people here in the room and welcoming a whole bunch more people online this evening. We're so glad that you've joined us. Our purpose this year and every year is to lift up and examine a topic that those two civil rights leaders would have cared about and fought for were they still with us. Part of their vision of a just society. And as Dr. King said in one of his most enduring quotes, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And we see that in the context of climate change. So building a strong and just community is also central to our mission and the mission of every YWCA. And so it is fitting for us to present to you tonight, Climate Justice in Connecticut, a powerful panel discussion with 4 experts in the state. We will examine the impacts of climate change on the state with focus on the disparate impact that climate change has on communities of color and other marginalized communities who all have the fewest resources to respond and recover from those impacts. We are always very solutions oriented in our presentations, and so we'll also examine the ways that we can address these disparities in a more inclusive and equitable approach going forward. Many thanks, first of all, to our guest moderator, who many of you know, Denise Savageau, who was the longtime conservation director for the town of Greenwich. She's now an environmental consultant and serves on the Governor's Council on Climate Change and its Equity and Environmental Justice Subcommittee. Thank you so much, Denise. And sincere thanks also to our 3 outstanding panelists, and Denise will introduce them to you shortly. Their impressive bios are also in your programs. We are also profoundly grateful to the 47 community partners who have joined us to co-sponsor this event this evening, and their logos are on the screen and in your programs. We thank them every day for their partnership in promoting a just community, and they include houses of worship, schools, the town of Greenwich, nonprofits from across our community and our region, as well as the other 3 YWCAs in the state of Connecticut. Also partnering with us for tonight's event are several of our elected officials, and so we'll now play a short video with greetings from Senator Richard Blumenthal and Congressman Jim Himes.
Hi, I'm Richard Blumenthal, your United States Senator. Sorry that I'm missing this great event. I really regret that Senate votes prevent me from joining you in person today as the Y pays tribute to Dr. Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King's inspiring activism. I often have the pleasure of attending YWCA events, and I know firsthand the amazing professionalism and dedication of your staff and volunteers under the outstanding leadership of Mary Lee Kiernan. Today's panel honors the King legacy about the urgent need for environmental justice. For decades, communities of color have borne the brunt of pollution and environmental hazards. Industrial facilities that emit toxic contaminants and hazardous waste are disproportionately located in or near communities of color. Whether it's brownfields containing soil toxins and harmful remnants of past industrial use, or air pollution resulting from ongoing coal or oil burning. Many of these disparate sources of pollution are an urgent moral and policy imperative. Environmental racism illustrates the truth of Dr. Martin Luther King saying that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. In the last Congress, we passed a number of provisions that are important, like the Inflation Reduction Act, or the $3 billion in environmental justice block grants to invest in community projects in disadvantaged communities, the bipartisan infrastructure law, providing billions of dollars to address brownfield sites. But there is plenty of work still to be done. Thank you to Denise Savageau, Sharon Lewis, Brenda Watson, and Ashley Stewart for your participation today and your crucial activism. Thanks to the Greenwich YWCA. I look forward to seeing you in person, working with you on this important cause, and thank you for letting me participate in this way.
Hi, everyone. I'm Congressman Jim Himes, and I'm delighted to be able to offer some greetings at the start of this wonderful conference being organized by the YWCA on the topic of climate equity, and to help us all think about how we need to address the urgent problem of climate change, making sure that we do not leave behind populations that have traditionally been disenfranchised or marginalized. We see all over the world, and we see here in the United States, what happens when natural disasters affect places. Katrina in New Orleans, who was hurt by Sandy many, many years ago in Connecticut. I have the honor of representing communities that are very affluent and communities that are not affluent. And I see every single day the difference between what communities are located next to power generators with all that that implies for childhood asthma, what communities like Washington Village in Norwalk or Marina Village in Bridgeport get brutally and dangerously hurt by climate events. And it's an indication that as we do the important work of addressing the existential crisis of this generation, climate change, we need to especially look out for those populations that don't necessarily have the resources or who are primarily exposed to the danger, to make sure that the changes we make are equitable and address those most at risk in ways that are appropriate and that remediate an awful lot of the damage that was done in the past. So thank you to the YWCA and to all who are participating today for making us conscious of the need, not just to address climate change, but to do it in a way that is suffused with the notion of justice.
Fred Camillo was trying to be here tonight and sends his very, very best wishes. So just a reminder that at the end of our panel's discussion at about 8:15 p.m., we will have a question and answer segment. And so here in the room, you have little white index cards in your programs, and we'll collect those cards with your questions at the start of the Q&A. And for those folks attending remotely on Zoom, please type your questions into the chat feature, and we'll get those questions to our moderator. So thank you everyone in the room and on Zoom for joining us this evening. Again, profound thanks to our four experts here tonight and for the work that you do every day. And Denise, I'll just hand it right over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Lee. It's great to be here in Greenwich. This is a wonderful community. I was very pleased to serve as the conservation director for over 20 years and doing a lot of work with the conservation community, but all the community, and working with Mary Lee at the Y and different folks. It's a really special place, and I appreciate that this program is happening here. What I'd like to do to start is introduce my panelists. And since I've retired from the town of Greenwich, I've taken on some roles working statewide on a variety of issues. And the ladies to my left, I've had the pleasure of working with, and so I'll introduce them. Sharon Lewis is the executive director of the Connecticut Coalition for Environmental Justice, which promotes environmental justice through community advocacy and engagement. She was exposed to advocacy at an early age. Sharon worked for corporate America in the reinsurance and insurance industry for 17 years, where she traveled extensively, representing insurance interests with regard to major catastrophes such as hurricanes, tornadoes, and other natural disasters. It was her dealing with the Love Canal situation that gave rise to her feelings for the lack of environmental justice in low-income communities of color. So that's Love Canal and what happened in Bhopal. Currently, she serves on the board of Rivers Alliance, and I get to serve on that board with Sharon, as well as several other environmental and health committees convened by the state of Connecticut. So Sharon, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Denise.
Next is Brenda Watson, and Brenda is the Executive Director of Operation Fuel, a statewide organization that ensures equitable access to energy for all by providing year-round energy and utility assistance, promoting energy independence, and advocating for affordable energy. Brenda has served as Executive Director and Director of Community Programs at Operation Fuel. She has also been a transportation planner for the Capital Region Council of Governments and serves on the Governor's Council on Climate Change, the Conservation Law Foundation Connecticut Board, and the board of the Connecticut Green Bank. And thank you for joining us today, Brenda. And last, but certainly not least, and I've just recently had the pleasure of starting to work with Ashley. Ashley is the manager of community engagement for the Connecticut Green Bank, the nation's first green bank. It was established to accelerate the deployment of clean energy using limited public dollars to attract private capital investment in clean energy projects, and in doing so, making clean energy more affordable and accessible to consumers. The Connecticut General Assembly recently expanded the charge of the Green Bank to include climate change adaptation and resiliency. And Ashley has come on as an environmental planner. Well, excuse me, Ashley also served as an environmental planner for the town of Bloomfield, a researcher at the Yale School of Environment, and worked for many years with the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And as I was saying, she came on board with the Green Bank really to look at this adaptation and resiliency issues. And we're really pleased that she's there. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of background on the topic of climate and climate justice, just to kind of to set the stage. And then I'm going to ask some questions of our panelists. So I just wanted to start really quickly with, weather and climate, because people get these always confused, and you always hear people saying, it's really cold outside. And by the way, it's going to be very cold this weekend, if you haven't heard the news. And so how could there be climate change? And we really need people to understand weather is what's happening now. Climate is average. So it's the average temperatures. It's the average meteorological conditions that are happening. And it's those long-term that we're really seeing, changes in the climate that are resulting in temperature changes, changes in precipitation, changes in the way storm events are happening. And it's really important for us to think about that. When we think about how we live, every single day we worry about the weather. What are we going to wear? What are we going to do? Weather impacts us every single day, right? And so when you think about that, and that we're going to, over time, now start changing those averages, it really is a big deal. And so climate expectations in Connecticut, just so you understand what we're dealing with, by 2050, the Yukon has put out some great information on this. Average temperatures are expected to increase by 5 degrees. So what's ever 5 degrees? Who cares? Who cares if it's 90 or 95, right? But it really makes a difference. And I like to talk to people about those changes in temperatures. Think about, like, does it matter if it's 33 degrees or 32 degrees? Certainly does. We're going to get rain or we're going to get snow, right? So it's important. And we think about that as an average over the year, that it's huge. It's resulting in things like the number of heat days increasing from 4 to 48 days, from 4 heat days a year to 48 heat days a year. That's extreme heat. And of course, where are we going to feel that the most, right? So we're going to be talking about that. Average precipitation to increase 4 inches a year. And for those of you who live in Greenwich, but also across the state, we had a drought this year. So we're talking about more precipitation, but we're talking about changes in precipitation, the way it's falling. Precipitation all at once, and then long periods of drought. And we're seeing these changes in rainfall patterns that really wreaking havoc on what we really know in terms of managing our water resources, whether it be public drinking water supply or whether it be riverine systems. And of course, we're looking at sea level rise, up to 20 inches of change we're expecting by 2050. And that, and when I started coming out with some of these predictions, that was several years ago. And here we are now, and we're looking to update these, and we'll see that, where we are on target. And what they have found is, a lot of the predictions are not only coming true, but climate change is happening faster than they even predicted. And with sea level rise, it's going to be really interesting. So for the coastal communities like Greenwich, we really need to pay attention to this. So that's what's happening. So if you look at this map, and you can kind of see the shoreline, or everything in blue, with the blue, the shoreline, and then up the I-91 corridor. So I-95 and then up the I-91 corridor. And we can look at where we're having, the biggest vulnerability for flooding. And of course, the coast, because of sea level rise, really going to be impacted. When you think about where our populations are, and then our most vulnerable populations, we're looking, along the shoreline. Similarly, and again, no surprise, there's the heat index, and you can see, where's Bridgeport? Where's Stamford? Where's Greenwich? Where's Norwalk? It's like, where's New Haven? We can find those spots pretty readily on this map, right? And it's like the heat index is really something we're looking at. And one of the challenges with heat, and when we're looking at that in terms of climate change and being prepared for it, is all of a sudden we're going to have these high heat days, but it doesn't happen like a hurricane where all of a sudden we have all this emergency preparedness. It just gets hot and hotter. And I have to say, I think this is one of the places where, as a state, we're most vulnerable, because we really haven't been dealing with this idea of extreme heat and what that really means in our communities, and particularly for our most vulnerable communities. So I just want to put this in the context of what we're talking about now. So what's going to happen in Connecticut, more heat, more rain, sporadic rain, more flooding. But we're looking at, in terms of when we're talking about climate justice, as I said, climate impacts everything, right? Everything we do, when you think about it. It's like, what about our food? What about our local food supplies? Everything we're talking about is impacted. So we look at social justice, housing, jobs, transportation, education. Climate change? Maybe, let's talk about it. But then when we talk about environmental justice, air, water quality, soil, all of these things, food security, access to open space, making sure we have urban forests. There's all of these challenges from a climate change perspective. But when we're looking at the social justice, we don't want to leave that out, because we have a green economy. We're trying to move into a green economy. How are we trying to tackle climate change? From the idea of creating green jobs, for doing things like energy efficiency, for installing clean energy. How are we making sure that we're not leaving people out of the new green economy that we're trying to create? So we're looking at that. How do we make sure that when we're looking at housing, we're making sure that we're doing it in a just way, in an environmental justice way, and in a climate justice way, that we're not just saying we need more housing, we need more housing done right. So we're looking at that, and we're making sure that it's resilient and sustainable for everyone. So we're doing it in equity. So with that in mind, let's just talk a little bit about some of the national statistics. When we're talking about environmental racism and environmental justice, 75% Black Americans are more likely to live in fence line communities. That means they're fenced out or fenced into an area. We see this. It's like they're fenced out of parks, they're fenced out of different areas. We've blocked them in by highways. We've blocked this so they don't have access, let's say, to the coastline. We've created these what they call fence lines. And nearly 70% of Black Americans live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. So again, as we transition to clean energy, are we making sure that these communities have access to that new green, clean economy? Are we modernizing the grid to make sure that they are part of this modern grid? Approximately 3 out of 5 Black Americans reside in areas with uncontrolled waste plants. So how do we look at that? So waste is a huge part of what we're dealing with. And when we're talking about waste, and then we're talking about climate change, all these problems just get more exacerbated by the impacts of climate change, how we deal with waste, how we deal with a lot of things that are just normal environmental issues. Everything is exacerbated when we get to climate change. And so when we're talking about natural disasters, well, who's in the floodplains? Where is the house? Who can't move? I'm gonna just tell you a quick story about what happened in Greenwich during Superstorm Sandy. I happened to be working in the Emergency Operations Center, and we were dealing with major coastal flooding, right? We didn't have, it was a dry event, or it was a dry hurricane. We didn't have a lot of rains. We didn't have a lot of riverine flooding. So it was mostly all about coastal. It was some high winds, and we had fires, we had all kinds of stuff happening. And there was a big concentration on it, but we lost power for a week. So when we lose power for a week, who does that impact the most? What do I do, as a resident? But what do people do who are financially burdened when all of a sudden all of the food they had in the refrigerator is gone? And now they have to replace all that food. Well, I just go to the supermarket and take out my credit card. But a lot of people can't do that. So when you have power outage for a week, so when we think about storm events, it's not just the flooding, there's other consequences, these long power outages. It's like the emergency lights in some of our housing units went out because they were on battery power, but the battery power only lasts 48 hours, right? Or 72 hours. If we're not taking care of that, so disproportionately impacted. And when we found out that these people, the people who were in these communities were not accessing food, it was like, what? No one called up Emergency Operations Center and told us that this was happening. And I think it was a shock. And really, one of the ways we got notified were those of us, and I was one of them, who had worked on the community gardens at one of our housing authority sites, started getting some text messages. And so, because I was in the Emergency Operations Center, I was actually one of the few people who could get messages and saying, wait a minute, what's going on here? So we need to think about the vulnerable communities, and as we're dealing with these emergency, what type of situations they're in. And so again, when those storm events are happening more and more, climate justice just makes this exacerbates this. I think we've heard about different places, Flint, Jackson, Benton Harbor, Michigan, all water quality issues. And one of the major challenges with climate change is surrounding water. It's these storm events, more flooding, more drought, more challenges with water quality, a host of things going on here. That's not going to go away. But we have inequities in Connecticut. We don't have to go to Flint, Michigan to find inequities, right? There's over 600 potential pollution sources in each of our 5 major metropolitan areas. We have major challenges with inequities in Connecticut. And our BIPOC population, people with disabilities, low income, are disproportionately impacted by this. So I'm just going to highlight, and right before I start the questions, just a couple of things that are happening right now. This is happening in Connecticut now, and think about this in relationship to climate change. In Hartford, we have historic problem in Hartford with combined sewer overflows and backup of sewer into people's homes because they're in low spots and the system is failing, and the sewage ends up backing up into people's homes, including one of our panelists is dealing with this right now. But it's a huge problem, and we have combined. So now think about that in relationship to climate change. When we're having more rainfall, these flash flood events, what does this mean for these combined sewer systems? Real problem in all, and that's in all of these 3 areas. But Hartford has a real historical problem. Bridgeport, Bassick High School, they're looking at putting in a brand new high school in in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and they're putting it in the coastal floodplain. The 100-year floodplain, brand new high school. Could you imagine saying we're going to put the brand new high school, not knowing what sea level rise it really means? I mean, the predictions are by it's going to be 20 inches higher, and that's vertical inches. That's not like going like this, kind of gradually up. It's like vertical and then over, right? It's a lot of sea level rise, and they're looking at putting the high school there. And then in New Haven and East Haven, they're looking to expand the Tweed Airport. And again, it's in the coastal area. They're looking at displacing over 100 homes. So we've got moderate and low income homes, but it's like, but guess what? We can take out those homes and put in, airport parking. And it's like, is this really what we need to be doing? And how is this exacerbated by climate change? You're building an airport in a neighborhood. And this community knows something about airports in neighborhoods. We fight it, right? There's a lot of fighting going on about White Plains Airport, which is in White Plains. It's in Westchester, or right over the boundary here. But think about this in relationship now that we're in, this really low income area in New Haven and East Haven, and what, and they've kind of softened the blow. They were trying to say, like, tell the New Haven people, oh, well, it's not going to happen here. And then realize, like, because we're doing it it's a border issue, and now they're impacting the low income community in East Haven. So these are some of the challenges. And when you think about, like, how these now all get exacerbated by climate change, we need to be thinking about, like, what are we doing? What kind of jobs do we need to be doing? So I think that's the last slide. Yep. So, yep. That's okay. So I'm just gonna, when you ask me to pull that up, we'll put that back up. So I'm gonna start with the questions, and the first one's gonna be to Sharon. Sharon, you do a lot of work and training on environmental justice statewide. So we've gone through a few things, but what do the terms environmental justice and climate justice mean to you?
Well, first of all, Denise, can you all hear me? I want to make a correction. It's statewide, nationwide, and worldwide. Just want to make sure get that clear.
Absolutely.
So what does environmental justice and climate justice mean to me? First of all, climate justice is a part of environmental justice. And I'm sure many of you have seen the definition of environmental justice from the EPA, which I really don't agree with. I believe that environmental justice occurs when everyone shares equally in the burdens as well as the benefits of the environment, and that no one group of people it's disproportionately exposed to the worst that our environment has to offer. To me, when this occurs, that's environmental justice. Now, climate justice, pretty much the same thing. When you hear the word justice, you think of fairness, equality, equity, closure. You think of a court case, justice has been served. Well, in the case of climate justice, you have to take it one step further, because people worldwide are suffering right now from global warming. And the people who are most impacted have the least to do with it. The people who are most impacted contribute the least to global warming. And yet they're more exposed than anyone to fossil fueled industries that cause global warming. They're living in neighborhoods in the United States that are surrounded by highways, transportation, another major contributor. So for me, when it comes to environmental justice and climate justice, the solution is to have the people who are impacted leading the charge on all the solutions. So I'll stop right there.
Thanks, Sharon. Does anyone want to jump in? I should have said that at the beginning. If anyone, the questions are to Director One, but if anyone wants to jump in or add anything, feel free.
I would actually like to add that energy justice is also a component or pathway into climate justice. And that the last time I checked, I believe 30% of carbon emissions comes from buildings and homes. And if our old housing stock is not weatherized, which will help reduce energy burden for the people that are living in those buildings, it would also assist in confronting climate change. And that energy justice is that one piece that doesn't get the attention that it should get when you're talking about energy and climate justice. But I just wanted to add that piece to it.
Thanks.
That's an excellent piece because a lot of the utilities don't understand why certain people can't pay their bills. But if you're living in a substandard house with no insulation and all that heat goes out the window or through the walls, or in the summertime where you just can't get cool enough, they can't figure out why you just can't pay your bill because the utilities go up and up. And it's really sad because 75% of the people in Hartford are renters. So you really lose an element of control there when you even control heat. I've seen situations where landlords put these governors on the boilers and they control what happens. So they keep the temperature at 70, knowing there's no insulation. And sometimes 70 is not hot enough when that is going right out the door. So thank you for elevating that because energy justice is very, very real. And correct me if I'm wrong, but is it 30% or what is the percentage of a person's income that goes into energy like utilities?
In some cases, it can range anywhere between 6 to 50%. And for the average low income consumer, it really does range around 30 to 50%. 6% is when your energy bills are affordable. And, you know, and to Denise's point earlier, when she spoke about what do vulnerable populations do when they lose their power, she can go to the grocery store. I can go to the grocery store with my credit card, and it's a poor choice to make, but where I don't have to worry about my home medical device losing power either, because fortunately enough, I'm pretty healthy and my family is pretty healthy. But you have folks who are vulnerable that rely on medical devices to keep them alive, whether they have respiratory issues or need wheelchair access to get in and out of their building. And in some cases, a refrigerator is a home medical device to keep your medications refrigerated. So that's a piece that has not been studied in terms of what the energy burden is for people. It's an emerging area of study now because you have a whole new generation of energy experts who are looking at this in a more broadly, where back in the day when I first started at Operation Fuel, we were studying energy burden as it compared to one's income, but it never accounted for one's reliability, their access to a modern grid, and how much energy they need to consume to stay healthy. Very often people that we serve at Operation Fuel are keeping their thermostats at unsafe levels to keep that energy bill down, and that's dangerous. So I just wanted to touch on that piece too.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into the question. So just build on that a little bit, Brenda. We often think of climate change and how it is drastically altering temperature, sea levels, and rainfall on a global scale. And to Sharon's point, this is a global issue, and it impacts, again, the most vulnerable the most, and the people who are using the least amount of energy. The impacts, however, are already being felt locally here in Connecticut. And as executive director of Operation Fuel, can you help us understand a little bit more? You started getting into it, but do you have more to add about the health and economic impacts to the daily lives of our most vulnerable residents?
Right. So, as I alluded to earlier, Operation Fuel had been studying energy burden. We released our first energy affordability gap study in 2003 that was authored by Roger Colton, who's an economist known across the country who advocates on behalf of folks who are struggling with their home energy bills. And where that study noted the difference or the gap that exists between what affordable bills are supposed to be and what actual bills are, he came up with a formula that noted that no one should be paying more than 6% of their annual income on home energy. Anything above that makes it unaffordable. And that's when people who are already vulnerable to other issues such as food insecurity or housing insecurity are now that much more burdened by their energy bills. But what I think has kind of hurt our movement in advocating on this issue is that study didn't look at this globally. It didn't look at how the utility companies behave in the regulatory and policymaking process, and that for a very long time, they've had their way with that process. It didn't look at how the state mandates utility companies to behave as it relates to shutting folks off or protecting them during the winter. And now that we've got a potential of 48 days of heat waves, protecting people in the summer, which is where death is more likely to occur compared to winter. When people perish in a winter, it's usually because of a slip and fall or a heart attack from shoveling snow. It's not because people are freezing to death. In the summer, we're all vulnerable to high temperatures, but if you are living with a respiratory disease, if you have a heart condition, if you are a child under 6, then you are that much more vulnerable to serious harm or even worse, death when the temperature increases and you're living in a home that's without power. So I think that studying this in a way that represents one's whole life is the way to go about enforcing or recommending policy that would strictly enforce or strongly enforce the utility companies to behave differently. Electricity is now a basic need. It's a human basic need. It's, in my opinion, a human basic right. The federal government has not identified that as such, which I think is problematic. I think that when, in my own opinion, when electricity became an invention as something that would deliver power to individual homes and businesses, it was a business invention. But we are now at a point where it's a basic need. It's not only keeping people healthy, it's keeping people alive. And I think during the pandemic, we realized how critical electricity is. And it impacts every aspect of our life. Even if you go on a hike, you're very likely not going to go without one of these. And then you need electricity to charge it. So just being outside requires electricity in some case. So I think we're at a point now where the energy burden conversation is finally elevating, and it's making its way up to the conversation around environmental justice and climate justice. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done on a policy and regulatory level.
Thank you.
I guess I can add
Sure.
one more thing.
Mhm.
I love what you just said, Brenda. When I talk about the energy burden and electricity, I call it oxygen because that's what it is today.
Mhm.
They want to take the oxygen away. Every time they shut your power off, you can't breathe.
I think when you're looking at the heat island effects that we're having and that we're expected to have, and how that exacerbates air quality, we're going to have, we talked about that we're going to have more, heat index days. So that's high heat. But those, what runs in parallel with that is, when we have high heat days, and it's all high heat days, it's in this area, it's high heat, high humidity, and that's going to mean poor air quality. So we're going to really up that level of number of air quality days. And, again, folks who are in in overburdened communities that already are subject. And I think, Fairfield County, it's all of Fairfield County that's feeling this burden. And how do we deal with that? So we need to be prepared. And I will say, from the work that I've done on the Governor's Council of Climate Change and whatever, there's a lot of focus on, again, infrastructure and kind of dealing with these major storm events. And I think that we haven't done enough yet on the heat. And we're actually interesting. We're working with UConn, and we had the drought this year. And we said, do you have any information on climate change and drought yet? And they said, oh, we didn't do a fact sheet on that yet. So I think we're going to be seeing some of these other impacts, because again, it's always about the flooding, because but like heat, drought does that same thing. And of course, we have drought a lot of times when we're having those high heat, right? Just extended periods of heat, just extended periods of no rain. So it's something we need to pay attention to. Even in a state like Connecticut, it's like one of the things that we didn't show in the slide is that the northeastern part of the United States is going to see the most drastic temperature changes and the most important drastic climate changes. So we're seeing wildfires in the West, and we're seeing that the desert is being a desert. But really, in terms of the changes that you saw in those temperatures, those most dramatic are going to be happening in the northeastern part of the United States. And to be honest with you, we don't know what that is going to mean from the ecosystem services of our forests and how we provide water. We're on a real learning curve here. So, and again, it's like who has access to clean air, clean water, that just gets, enlarged, and we need to be thinking about that. So I have a question. Oh, go ahead, Ashley.
Before you go to the next question, I do want to kind of go back to the environmental justice as a whole. I think sometimes we silo the conversation of environmental justice, but it kind of doesn't matter what brings you into the conversation. Like if you care about climate change, if you care about the future of the planet, if you care about the community, all of those things will bring you into the conversation about environmental justice. So some of the things, and I know it'll probably get fleshed out in the conversation going forward, but one of the things that I'm acutely aware of is literally our waste, our energy waste, our water waste, our carelessness with climate impacts, or even how we treat our neighbors shows up in all aspects of our lives. So I guess, sorry to like stop the conversation, but I guess I want to make sure we highlight that environmental justice is not a conversation on its own. It is embedded in every aspect of our lives. Climate justice, or just injustice, period, because climate change exists because of injustice. They are tied together. And if we are going to solve any problems in this world, we have to deal with injustice. We have to deal with the haves, who feels the impact. I mean, I might have a generator. When the lights go out, I'm going to be okay for a little while. But that only goes to a certain limit. I will feel the impacts at some point. Our most marginalized communities are our canaries. If we listen, they are the ones that are telling us that there's something coming if we listen. But often we don't listen. We don't value those voices. We don't value their opinions, or we don't believe that what they're saying is true. We kind of hush them and say, that's outlandish. Those things don't relate. But they are our canaries to let us know that there's more coming. The impacts, the heat impacts, the death tolls, even the COVID rates were all signs of how are we as a community dealing with what we will face as a community. Like all of our plights are tied together. So sorry to stop the conversation, but I kind of did.
Oh, no, I think it just brings in the conversation. And I think the idea of, when we talk about community, a lot of times we talk about climate change and what we're going to do, we talk about climate resilience, or I should say community resiliency. And how do you have community resiliency if the whole community isn't resilient?
Yeah,
We need to lift all boats.
absolutely.
Can I just say one more thing to
Okay.
interrupt it?
Look at,
Um,
I'll let you do one more.
Okay, one more. When I talk about environmental justice, I often say that it's not just about pollution. And if you look at one of the slides that Denise had, where she had all the social issues at the top and the environmental justice issues at the bottom, I take all of those social issues and put them underneath environmental justice. It's very clear that you understand that it's not just one issue. And as Ashley has said, it's about everything. It's about everything we do, everything we say. And I often say, to copy a commercial, if you see something, say something. If you hear someone talking in a manner that marginalizes people, say something. Don't just let it slide, because those conversations lead to the injustices at the courthouse, in housing, in education, in the environment, because those people, even though you may not believe those beliefs, but those people are the commissioners, and those people are the decision makers, and you need to make them hear what they're saying. So I'm sorry, Denise.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, Ashley, for you. The Connecticut Green Bank has been leading much of the work relating to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by moving away from fossil fuels to a clean energy future. How do we ensure that marginalized communities are part of the new clean energy economy?
So I'm new to the Green Bank. I'm fairly new, but part of the Green Bank's reputation is that they've pulled private investment to help solve and address the public policy goals that the state set. They did that in clean energy, and they're continuing to do that in clean energy. Now, the Green Bank last year was given a scope expansion to include environmental infrastructure, which is a really broad label, to include investment in water, waste, land, conservation, parks, and a whole lot of other environmental markets. That was kind of like their promotion. The state said, wow, Green Bank, you guys have been doing a great job in clean energy investment for the state. We're seeing low income and LMI, low and middle income communities or homeowners taking on solar at high rates. Congratulations, keep doing that work, but we're going to increase your scope so you can do it in other areas. So that's where I came in. The Green Bank's new work to invest in infrastructure, environmental infrastructure, is all about and has taken the first step of addressing, reaching out to communities first. So listening to stakeholders, hearing what are the needs infrastructure-wise, where were the gaps in investment, what types of environmental investment are we dealing with or needing stormwater infrastructure in cities, or do we need more open space in certain areas across the state? What are the needs of our communities? And that way we can start developing programs with that in mind. So that's where we are. That's how the Green Bank is centering marginalized communities. It's first listening before we even create what next. And this new aspect of the Green Bank is very new, like brand spanking new. But we're really hopeful about the success that they've had in clean energy coming over into other areas of environmental infrastructure, so we can deal with more resilience issues across the state. Yeah, we got a lot of problems, and the Green Bank wants to do their part in that. Yeah.
And I think that there's a big role, and I love that they expanded the role of the Green Bank, getting private capital to invest in, the public good work that needs to happen.
Absolutely.
And it's really important. And it's such a success story. We're seeing green banks pop up across the nation in other states.
Mhm.
And to have such a success story in Connecticut is really encouraging.
Yeah. We in Connecticut love being the first at something. So we were the first Green Bank. So it feels good, but we also want to lead in this environmental infrastructure investment also. So I'm an environmentalist, I'm an engineer, I'm a planner. It took me a long time in my career to realize that we need funding to reach some of our goals. Actually, all of them, but we need money. Right? It took me a while. I could say a lot about the work I've done, but if we can't finance those things, if we can't actually actualize them, how do we meet the climate future that we're about to see? So yeah.
I'm going to go to Brenda. Brenda, you serve on the Governor's Council on Climate Change. It's also better known if somebody hear you say GC3. How has Connecticut as a state prepared for climate change, whether it be legislative, policy, enforcement? And what additional changes in policy do you see? Or at the state level, at the local level, or even at the national level? Where do you see us needing to go?
Well, what I do like that one of the outgrowths of the GC3 work was to address the weatherization barriers in the state, and the Connecticut Deep Department of Energy and Environmental Protection released an RFP. I think it was close to 18 months ago, that would source $12 million to an operator who would work in low and moderate income communities to help provide access to folks who are living in older homes that need remediation of mold, asbestos, anything that's going to prevent weatherization services, which weatherization is a method to seal up your home, replace your shower heads with low flow shower heads, and window sealers and things like that to, keep the heat in and keep the cool air in the summer. So $12 million dedicated to that, which I think is critically important because we live in New England. I believe 30% of our housing predates the 60s. So there's bad materials in those homes. There was a time where we thought those were good materials, but they're not healthy. So I think we are leading in that aspect, but I would like to see more being done in that area. We need to socialize infrastructure. And I utilize this as an example a lot. You all might recall several years ago where a part of the state, Eastern Connecticut, homeowners were suffering from crumbling foundations. And within a matter of 1 or 2 legislative sessions, there was a solution to address that. And for everyone that owns a home, you paid a surcharge on your homeowner's insurance to go into a fund that would support those homeowners to help rebuild their homes. However, what was happening at the same time of that, in the New Haven, Bridgeport region, there were several homes, about 1,200 homes that were in foreclosure because of unpaid water utility bills. Now, it cost the state roughly $130,000 to provide services to a homeless family. In addition to what other costs that come with becoming homeless, the disruption in your everyday life, the disruption in your child's education, just everything. I calculated roughly around a $1 million price tag to help those homeowners stay in their homes. The crumbling foundations piece was well above that. In addition to the state responding in that way, because these homeowners mobilized, they got the attention of their locally elected officials, state elected officials, and even our congressional delegation. There was a response to it on the Energize CT website as well. So if you go to the Energize CT website, you'll see this in bold, and I'll read it. If your home has a crumbling foundation that has been verified either by chemical analysis or by a qualified professional engineer, we want to help you. You may qualify for special offerings for energy efficiency services and equipment. Meanwhile, we've known for a long time that we live in an old state, that 30% of the homes that are in a weatherization pipeline cannot be weatherized because of the issues that prevent weatherization. But we find solutions for people who have the resources to mobilize and get the attention of their elected officials. And it costs way more money to let that part of the state fail. So I was, of course, 100% behind supporting this effort. If it's going to go on my homeowner's insurance bill, I won't see it. Just go ahead. Yeah, $11, I think it was. But we have an accumulation of low and moderate income homeowners and renters who are always neglected. Somehow the solutions just can't be found for these people. So they're just on their own. I'm glad now that there's a $12 million effort to help those folks, but that's not enough. We need to dig deeper. So I'm proud of the work that the GC3 has done. There's just a lot more to be done.
Thanks. Sharon, you work with, right in the local communities, and with a lot of community-based organizations. How are the community-based organizations and coalitions responding to the climate and environmental crisis? Is there a sense of urgency, awareness?
Well, I not only work with folks in the community, I live in the community.
Mm-hmm.
So when I say we or us, I really mean we and us. If you look at that photo on the left in Hartford, that's trucks in front of my house. On December 4th, I had a massive sewer backup in my basement, the worst they've ever seen. It happened on December 4th. MDC came out to see me January 12th. I don't want to talk too much about it because I will go on, but I'm not happy about it. But I will tell you that in everything I've done, I've been in the EJ movement, I can't believe, well, more years than I'd like to say. Anyway, everything that's occurred in the neighborhood, I've experienced it. And this is one of the worst ever. I really now understand what happens. Problem is, there's all kinds of help out there, but what you don't know is the help is not easy to access. My event happened December 4th. I went to a local social service agency December 5th, told them, I have no furnace. I have no hot water heater. My oil tank is bobbing like the Titanic. The city shut my house down. December 5th, which is a Monday. Today is February 4th, what, 1st? I haven't heard back from them since. There is no sense of urgency. A lot of these agencies, with the exception of Operation Fuel, act like they're giving you their own personal money. They treat you in a very dehumanizing way. They talk to you any kind of way they want to. Here I was, totally devastated, horrified, all of a sudden houseless. And then I got to hear this talk on the other end that was very disrespectful. It's really sad, but more than one agency has treated me like I didn't exist. More than one agency didn't think that my situation was urgent. And this is the first time I've experienced this situation where I actually had to go to a social service agency, but they don't consider it urgent. No one considers it urgent other than those who are most impacted. Now, getting back to your question about the coalitions, one of the things that we do is we try to bring together diverse groups of folks, all types of stakeholders, because as I mentioned, all those social issues go underneath environmental justice. So we like to have coalitions with, housing folks, education folks, criminal justice folks, all types of environmental folks. But sadly, and I will say this honestly, like everything else I've said was honest, the most extreme racism that I've ever experienced has come from working with the people that I work with on a daily basis. And it is horrific. I spent all those years in the reinsurance/insurance industry, and I caught hell. I could only last 17 years, but I've never experienced it like it is now. Every time I make an attempt to sit at the table, fork is knocked out of my hand, chair pulled out from underneath me, no seat available. It is simply horrific.
I just wanted to add that what I learned from Sharon back in the fall was that no matter what one's income for Black and Brown individuals, we are still very highly likely to be impacted by a noxious burning facility. And I live in the town of Bloomfield, which is 3 miles outside of Hartford, which is dubbed North Hartford. And, when I thought about that, I was like, well, I purposely chose my house to be 15 minutes away from the highway. For, as a former transportation planner, I had my community development friends look at the property to make sure there wasn't going to be any development behind my home and all of that, but didn't even know that I was still within proximity to a burning facility. Dual income household, my husband and I, we both have master's degrees, we pretty successful and living in a suburban town, but it just so happens that we are still within proximity of a burning facility, which is, our income did not rescue us from the injustices of the past.
Not at all. And as I mentioned in the fall and everywhere I go, I make sure that when I describe environmental justice, I say low income and people of color. Most people say low income people of color. No, Not true. I grew up in a very affluent part of Hartford. Doctors, teachers, lawyers, business people. My parents both were entrepreneurs, and we lived within walking distance of the North Hartford landfill. There was a train that came through. In fact, it's so innocuous, I forgot it came through. I was on a Zoom call one day. Somebody said, "Is that a train?" I'm like, "Oh yeah." Within walking distance of an exit ramp from a highway, all types of industrial facilities. And this was an affluent community. So it's race, not income. That's the indicator, primary indicator of where undesirable land uses occur. Race, not income, when it comes to the siting of a regional landfill. Race, regional incinerator. Race, when highways exit right where you live. Let me give you another quick example. I did a presentation last year to a school in Farmington. And we got off the highway and we're driving and we're driving and we're driving. And I'm like, well, where is this place? Now, think how far that place was from the exit ramp. If you come to where I live, you get off the highway. Sharon, where are you? Well, just walk a few blocks and here I am. And when there are backups on the highway, guess where the trucks and the buses and the cars come? They get off the highway and come through town. So you don't consider that. So, you know, we're exposed to all the diesel exhaust. We already know that lead is persistent in the environment. And you wonder why people are so sick all the time.
Yeah.
The backup to that is there's a report. The United Church of Christ did a report, I don't know, years ago. And that
Toxic
report, for those of you that need research to back what you're hearing, that report concludes that that race is the primary indicator for exposure, for environmental impact or toxic exposure. So just like Sharon and Brenda were just saying, race and not income, although there are areas of the country that are primarily white that are poor and experiencing similar things, race is the primary indicator. So even if you're wealthy and Black, you're more likely to be exposed to toxic harm, hazards, all of that kind of stuff. And there are tons of research around this. One of the things that I say when people like to lean on research is there's enough research to justify inequity, continued racism, even right here in our backyard, here in Connecticut, where we think everyone is fairly liberal. There's enough research. The question is what habit will change, what policy will change, what value shift will happen so that the conclusion or the next iteration or the next generation will experience something different. So I just wanted to support you all in saying, if y'all want to continue to read about this, professors like Robert Bullard, Dr. Dorsetto Taylor, these are all researchers that have written tons about environmental justice, impact.
Yeah, and a lot of it had to do with starting with, you know, discriminatory housing policies, lending policies, where you were allowed to live, redlining of neighborhoods. And that, so we had settlement patterns that way. And so now we're dealing with that. And so although some of that is now gone, although not all of it, it's interesting. Quick story just in Greenwich, and this was several years ago, about probably 40 years ago. But when my husband was buying a house in Greenwich, in one of our neighborhoods with multifamily housing, the realtor told him, you don't want to buy on this street because there are people of color on this street. Well, he bought on that street and we lived there for many years. But so it was the real estate community that was saying it. I mean, this is something that was happening and continues to happen. So it's justified.
Just here in Connecticut, because we don't have a ton of new industry, it might not seem like this is a current day issue. Like you might think, oh, that's happening in the South somewhere, or that's happening somewhere far away from where we are, because we don't have new industrial industry, not in a lot, like not a whole lot of it at least. But the ways you see that, that pattern continue is in land use zoning. When a zone or neighborhood in proximity to an industrial zone continues to stay exactly the same, when development or care of that neighborhood declines, those are some of the reasons or ways we pull the impacts to the future. So although the decision was made about that zoning area, that area of town, that's the low income neighborhood, or the facilities that moved out now, but they were there. We moved that decision from being something that happened in the past to something that continues to impact communities into the future by not investing in the neighborhood, not cleaning up brownfields, not holding industry, even if it's not there, accountable for whatever impacts it has had here in Connecticut. I think the whole of New England is going to face a lot of this, right? We're running out of land in New England. Like Connecticut is super developed. What are we gonna do when we need more space? Do we continue to leave our brownfields because we didn't care about the neighborhood that it was in anyway? Or do we wait until we do want that property for some upscale something or another to come there, and then we clean it up? I think we check our values and we check those things, whether it's subtle bias or very explicit, and ask ourselves, why are we not making change into the future? Sorry if that was a
Yeah,
ramble.
so Ashley, you've led me right into our next question. This is for all the panelists, because it has to do with planning. And
Yeah.
so, when we talk about climate, then we're talking about resiliency planning related to climate change. The community engagement process is critically important. And historically, environmental justice communities have been left out of the planning process. So what steps do you think we need to take to create a more inclusive planning process as we're moving forward?
All right,
Go.
who starts?
I'll go.
Scott.
I'll go.
That's great.
Go ahead, Brenda.
I'll go, and the reason why I'm going is because Sharon touched on something that her personal experience I highlighted a couple years ago, in that policy and regulation historically has favored companies and not people. That's a huge problem. It has been a problem for a long time, but I think that everyone in this room, if you've already opened your electric bill, you're probably like, what? Why is the delivery, twice the amount of my actual usage? It's time that everyone in this space understand that they have a voice in the regulatory process, of course, in the policy-making process, and that we have to voice our opinions and our displeasure and what we're paying for utility rates. It's just, it's ridiculous. It's causing a lot of problems for people who cannot afford to pay those bills. It's the health impacts, along with just the personal impact to someone who is struggling with debt and in a constant cycle of crisis, the mental health impact that it's causing. That's one. Programs across the board, whether they be private, public, and nonprofit, are underserving our most vulnerable. In 2020, 500,000 households were subject to service termination. And I'm betting that it probably doesn't cost a lot of money. I mean, it's a big price tag, but not a lot of money in what some of these companies are making in profits. I know that there are ways in which the companies can do better to avoid those disconnections. Despite our advances in technology, Connecticut has not developed a single portal for residents to seek services when they need it. There's just, I mean, I can't think of how much I can do using my cell phone. From signing up to my next yoga class to probably even getting a mortgage. But for people who are struggling with just basic needs, there is not one single place that they can go to say, I need this, I need assistance with this, I need assistance with that, and this, and this, and then that someone would follow up with them. And instead, what we have is situations that Sharon has experienced, that people are mistreating her, not seeing her, and are not caring about the fact that she has been displaced from her home. Movement is fast and efficient depending on who is being prioritized. So now that everyone is being impacted by high utility rates, perhaps it's your voices that will help the legislature do something about it, to help push FERC, our Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to address this situation, to get this on the radar of ISO New England, who also plays a role in rates. I mean, the rate making process is so complicated now. It's not something that everyone can even explain or even begin to understand. But I think we all can relate to the fact that we're paying way too much for our utility bills. It's just too much. And the municipal utilities don't necessarily have those same issues. So you have to wonder, well, who do the municipal utilities answer to? Constituents. Well, then who do the investor-owned utilities answer to? Shareholders. So, you know, there's got to be something to that. I can't explain it, even though I've been doing this work for 13 years. It's very complicated.
Ashley?
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Ashley.
sure. I can try to be a little more concise so we can get to the next question, but at least for the planning, the land use planning side of things and municipal service in any form, committee work, volunteerism, staff. I think part of the problem is we haven't been telling ourselves the truth that the system isn't working the way it is. Every single town I know and have ever worked with says we're understaffed. We wish more people would volunteer. The same old people keep coming every time. I hope they keep coming, but still, we need more people. The system isn't working. And a few years ago, I interviewed this city planner the city planner was in Boston area, and their community was a Haitian community, and they talked about how they received public comment in some very informal ways. And I thought, man, that's revolutionary. I wish Connecticut would try things like that. And what I did, I was a planner at the time, environmental planner. I started doing the same thing. I started going to public events and asking people to just make comments, talk to me about their roads, their street. I got 5-year-olds talking about, oh, we can't bike down that street. Mom says it's not safe. And things like that led to a complete streets policy.
Mhm.
And did I need for them to walk into my town hall to tell me this? A lot of the times we pretend like that's the only way to receive content from our residents. And it's ineffective, it isn't working, and only the same voices are being heard, which in some ways is great. I'm glad that those that have been holding up the fort have been doing that, but it's not sustainable. And it is a waste of resources in a lot of ways because we put on programs, we start a new project, and it's not welcome and received by the community because they never asked for that. They rather you invest in something else or put your energy into something else. And instead, you heard from the two very loud voices in town, and that's the decision that was made. So in conclusion, I think planning wise, we need to rethink what engagement looks like. We need to rethink what public comment even looks like, and at what level, and how to prioritize those other methods of receiving content to just as equal as those methods that we already understand and know. So,
Yeah, I'm just gonna comment on that. Been as an environmental planner and working in the community. I didn't do the job I did by sitting behind my desk.
yeah.
And there were some people who criticized me. Denise isn't at her desk very often. She's out in the community, and
Right.
it was interesting. All the people, and I have a lot of folks in this room who know me and have worked with me. and knew I was out there, and they appreciated that. But there were some people in town hall that didn't appreciate that I wasn't at my desk all the time, and that I was actually out in the community and understood. And we had a flooding issue in one neighborhood, and they were having a neighborhood event, and I brought a map and just said, put your stickers on it. Where's stuff happening? And they all had to talk to me about their story, and I learned more about what was going on in that particular time from that. So I totally agree.
Yeah.
And I'm just putting it out there that some of the organizations that I know are represented here can help be that voice.
Yeah.
The why. It's like, where do people, if they're not going to come into town hall, where do they go, and how do we collect that information?
One
Right.
other thing I'll add to that, because I'm about to softball this to Sharon, because I know this is something that I hear from her often, and it reminds me that don't be afraid to engage with people. Like, I think there is actually a fear of engaging with people's concerns and the depth of their need. It can feel overwhelming, but honestly, there are solutions in that. And to not let that distract you, that gut feeling of, oh no, that's too much. Sharon, I feel like I hear your voice in my head.
That's why I'm not going to say anything. Thank you so much. You've said it so eloquently.
So we're going to get into we want to engage the audience. We've been talking for a long time, but before we do, I'm just going to let the panelists get one word in as I start going through and see what kind of questions we have. So if you have questions, please write them down on the cards. And I know some of the folks in the chat are putting in questions, and we'll take those. But we've discussed a lot relating to environmental justice, about climate change. If you had to say what you thought was the most urgent issue that you're tackling or that you see in Connecticut, for communities in Connecticut, what would it be? And why don't we start down with Ashley? I'm gonna put you on the spot, Ashley. And then.
So if you ask me next week, I might change my mind. Actually, if you ask me in an hour, I might change my mind. But what comes to mind first for me is, I think what's most urgent is remembering that I don't have to feel the impact for it to be a priority. I think often we try to personalize things. Well, this is my experience. This is how I've felt climate change, and this is the limit of my experience. So therefore it is everyone else's. And that's wrong. I don't have to live it or feel it for it to be true and necessary and to prioritize it. So that's the first thing that came to my mind. Literally, if you talk to me after this, I might have 3 more. So that's it.
I have 2, but I'll focus on energy parity. I heard the term parity used by utility companies, I think in 2020, and I didn't understand what it was, so I Google searched it and I started reading what it meant. So it basically means it's a concept that utility companies want to achieve when attempting to transition to renewable energy, that they have to be making the same amount of money that they would delivering clean energy as they would delivering energy that's powered by fossil fuels. So for me, I want to rebrand energy justice as energy parity, that everyone in this room, every resident in the state deserves energy parity, and that there needs to be fairness. This is an equal partnership. It shouldn't be that the utility companies get to kind of just mow their way through the policy and regulatory making process and be able to charge ratepayers for their lobbying efforts that do not benefit us, it benefits them, that companies should not be allowed by law to garnish wages, especially during a pandemic when people were shut down, which both companies did, our largest companies did. And so that's and similar to Ashley, if you ask me in 10 minutes, I'll share my second one.
Well, I'm not going to change my mind about what I think is the most pressing issue. It's always been my most pressing issue, and that is getting people to see the most impacted as humans. Because it's not until you realize that your next door neighbor or somebody across town or somebody in another part of the state is human, will you also understand what they're going through because you'll put yourself in their shoes? It's very difficult for me to get people to the table, to those decision-making tables, because nobody wants to give up their seat. Nobody. Those very people who, with their degrees, want to come in and tell people how they should live, what they should do, what is going to be done for them, are those very people who don't know what they're talking about. I often say that the quote unquote social scientists, I call them, they invented drive-bys because they sit in their cars and make a lot of stuff up. They don't get out of their cars. They don't go inside people's houses. They just make stuff up. But you have to go out and you have to talk to people and you have to be sincere and you have to understand that these people without the lettered degrees that you have are PhDs when it comes to the lived experience. They should all be at the table, and every climate solution should be led by those who are impacted. I don't see why that's a difficult thing to understand. How can I lead a cavalry of men in the army when I don't know what that means? Why should I be the general? I don't have a clue as to what it's like. But there are people who refuse to give up their position. Like I say, nobody wants to give up their seat. But there's one thing I learned from Shirley Chisholm. She said, bring your own chair. So every time I go someplace, I bring a folding chair. And if I need it, I say, somebody, can you go to my car, please? Click, click, bring my chair up, please. Because sometimes you have to be there. My goal now is to not only fight for a seat at the table, to prepare a table for you to come to. It's our table, and we're serving food that we want to eat.
Okay, we're going to get into questions. Mary Lee, do you have questions from the audience you want me to start with, or you want me to start with some of the online ones? Okay. While she's collecting those, let me just ask a question. And Brenda, I think you're going to be able to maybe help us with this one, or hopefully. Is that what was the historical role of deregulation in the explosion of affordability of utilities? Can you talk about that a little bit? And I know it's a huge topic, so.
Not in an articulate way, but I can say that what I've been hearing lately is that states that did not deregulate do not have the same issues with rates that we're having here in Connecticut. Unfortunately, that is the most that I can say about that particular issue. I also wanted to note that 20 years ago or 20 plus years ago, when Connecticut decided to deregulate, there were other states that were also doing it. And Roger Colton testified in New Jersey, noting that if states are going to do this, then what also needs to happen is all of these other issues or strategies need to also be working to ensure that what's happening now with rates does not happen. And so what he meant by that was basically kind of the work that Operation Fuel is doing, ensuring that people have access to programs that will help them pay their bills as the rates increase. And that communities should also have access to community choice aggregation, which is, and I apologize that I can't articulate what the definition of that is, but it's also basically giving communities the ability to choose who delivers electricity to them and can pick the most affordable vendor to deliver electricity.
Yeah. And when you talk about community choice aggregation, but also we're looking at that you can have a facility that the community owns collectively,
right,
that does renewable energy, clean energy.
Yeah.
So that when you have, let's say, a host of rental units where they don't have access to clean energy on their roofs,
yep,
but the community could invest and make it so that, oh, they are all buying into, and you know, somebody who's got the rooftop who agrees to do this, and they can collectively do, or maybe it would be a school or another town facility, and they could make that energy available. So
It's a shared clean energy.
it's a shared clean energy, and you know, we really haven't. It's been discouraged in Connecticut. Let me just talk quickly on the deregulation piece. When Eversource came into Greenwich to do you know, the new substation, I was working with some folks at the Green Bank who were pushing me along. Oh, let's put in a microgrid. They didn't want anything. So the reason that we couldn't put in a microgrid in Greenwich was because they made the argument that they could only do distribution. They couldn't do generation. So when you're talking about a microgrid and folks doing generation, and I was like, okay, that's a policy we need to fix, right? We should be able to do both, and to not have our utility kind of splitting hairs so that they weren't promoting microgrids is a challenge. So, okay, so one of the questions is, how can we avoid or shorten never-ending environmental impact studies and speed ahead to solutions and funding to make real changes?
Speed ahead though?
Yeah.
I mean, I can understand the question's desire to get to solutions, but I want to caution the questioner and not wanting to move too quickly. I think sometimes, anyway, environmental justice in general is supposed to be led by those that are first impacted, because the pace of that solution should be based on their need, right? So if they feel urgent, this is a pressing issue that needs to be resolved right now, then our tone in the room should be, this is a pressing issue. But if this is something that they want to walk through with care, we should also be listening to that pace too. So I've seen both instances happen in my career where those that are not impacted lead the pace. And it is not right. It's never right. And the community usually feels either dragged or forgotten in some way. But to the point of the impact studies, someone asked me, I did a thing recently. I guest lectured at a class at Yale, and one of the students asked about metrics. I guess my response to them was, and I want to use it now, is not to chase metrics, to believe people's stories, because stories often will come before we have a metric to test a thing. For example, PFAS is a huge issue in the state, across the country. It's a problem. If you don't know what it is a non-destructible chemical that is altering our futures. Whatever, I made that sound terrible. But we don't have the best ways to measure it yet. We don't even know the impact of it yet. But we should be believing people's stories first, because we don't even know, we don't have a way to measure yet. So to the question, yes, let's not get caught up in needing impact studies, but also let's do them too, I guess. Sorry, I don't know.
So Sharon, I think this one's for you. It says Sharon's organization made a presentation at the start of COVID that highlighted a comparison of citizen advocacy versus lobbyists for environmental or energy legislation. And industry far outspends and has far more access to legislators. What do you think we need to do to change that?
To change what? I don't remember that presentation.
Well, somebody remembers you
I
doing
do
it.
hundreds. Now, what was the question again?
Okay, so it's basically talking about advocacy.
Okay.
And obviously we have lobbyists that spend a lot of dollars. So industry lobbyists versus how does the private citizen get to the legislators and let them know what we need? What do we need to do in changing in that process?
Well, I find it very difficult to change that process because whenever there's money at stake, industry is going to hire lobbyists to change the minds of legislators.
Yeah.
But what the general public can do, and that's what we do well, is train people how to tell their stories succinctly. We train them how to tell it all in 3 minutes. Sometimes you don't even get 3 minutes. We make sure people are registered to vote because oftentimes we've met with legislators who will turn their backs, literally, when they find out that you're not registered to vote. So why should they even listen to you? So I tell people all the time, I'm not telling you to vote, I'm telling you to register to vote, because at no time will they know when you're going to pull that trigger and fire the shot to vote for them or not to vote for them. They get scared when they know that 1,500 people just registered to vote at PT Barnum in Bridgeport. Oh my God, which way are they going to vote? So we prepare people to testify at public meetings from the state level, local level. We bring them on field trips to the state legislature so that when they first see that dizzying floor for the first time, they don't get dizzy and fall down. And it makes it seem like I've been here before. We introduce them, just say, hey, you know, check the place out, show them where the cafeteria is, want people to be comfortable. It's like taking the SAT. I took it 3 times because I had to get comfortable. And then I got better and I got better. And that's what we do. We want to make sure that people get their stories heard.
And I think what also needs to happen is people need to donate to organizations that Sharon represents, because without money, she can't do the work that she's doing to train people. And very often in the nonprofit world, where we have our hands tied behind our back because it's looked down upon us to utilize our dollars for lobbying. You know, folks expect us to, donors expect us to use our dollars for programs, which is okay. And it's of course the right thing to do. But if all we're doing is programs, then we're really not making effective change in the policy space, in the regulatory space. I would love to be able to hire as many lobbyists as the utility company does so that I can surround elected officials the same way they do. I mean, if you go to the LOB, you'll see them surround members of Energy and Technology Committee, because that's where the action happens. You see them surround members of Planning and Development and surround members of Environment. And I would love to, I have one policy director and she does it all. Thank God she uses her power for good, because she is like a lawyer being paid nonprofit dollars, but she's highly effective. I'd love to be able to hire 3 more of her so that we could be just as effective as the companies are.
You're correct. We don't have a policy person. So our lobbying efforts are very limited.
So one of the things we heard from legislators the other day at the environmental summit by the Connecticut League of Conservation Voters is the legislators actually telling us that they wanted to hear more from the public. That they hear from, you know, it's like, okay, there's Janice again, sending in another, you know, email or, you know, Gannon sending in something, and it's effective. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting it's not.
Right.
But they really want to hear from folks. And I just want to let folks in this room know how easy it is now. You submit testimony online, it's really easy. The difficult part is knowing what's happening and following that. So, but there are some, but look at the groups. And I think, you know, folks should be paying attention. And what are the groups you're involved in looking at what's happening?
Yeah.
Is your legislators that you just elected from Greenwich, or the folks, you know, who are, you know, across the state, are they listening to you? Do you know what they're working on? And I think it's important, and particularly when they're new, they're really looking for direction. What do you care about?
Right.
And I think it's important. So that's a great question, because I think it's a really important one. I lost my screen here with my chat. Okay, there's my chat. Why not? Let me get one more from here. So you got into your definition, Sharon, of what environmental justice is. So somebody wants to know what the EPA definition is that you disagreed with. And I think it's important to maybe talk about that a little bit, because I think it's a limiting definition.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember, otherwise I would have said it the first time.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see. It's, they define environmental justice as, oh God, I can't believe I forgot it. Something to do with the rights of all people, regardless of race, creed, et cetera, to participate in the decision-making process or the environmental decision-making process. I forget the first part, but basically it's all about people having a right to participate in the decision-making process. But that to me doesn't mean or doesn't equate to justice, because you can participate as a member of a team or a part of the table. 2 of you could be at the table and 10 of you could vote against what you want to do. Does that mean that there's going to be environmental justice just because you're at the table? You have to make sure that your input is meaningful, that you are heard, and that people make policy changes in accordance with your needs and in accordance with your urgencies. I don't see that in the EPA's definition. That's why I say there will be no environmental justice until everyone shares equally. And if you look at the EPA definition, equally it's not even a part of it. You know, we need to share. We're always going to have environmental burdens. They're never going to go away. But there should never be a situation where one group is disproportionately exposed to all that's bad with the environment. There's some people who don't even have a clue what it's like to breathe fresh air, don't know what it's like to have open spaces. I was just telling people that my husband and I like to go to Old Lyme and Old Saybrook, and it's amazing how I breathe so much better. We leave the urban areas. It's amazing the difference in the quality of air. A lot of people don't even have that experience. I talk a lot about light pollution, where you're living in urban areas. There's so much light, and it affects how you sleep. It affects your psyche, your mental condition. I mean, there are places where they're so dark, you can actually hear crickets. I don't remember ever hearing a cricket in years where I live. And I live near the park, near the woods in Hartford. I don't remember hearing a cricket. It is such a wonderful sound.
So let me just add about the environmental justice. EPA, they kind of define it, and you and I have had this conversation. They kind of define it by the regulatory process and making sure people have access and input into that regulatory process. And when we're talking about environmental justice, when we're talking about social justice, and we're talking about, you know, the climate justice, all these issues that intersect, it's not just because we have a regulatory process. It's more than that. So I think that, you know, when you only look at it with those eyes that, well, you can participate in the regulatory process at a public hearing. Yes, we want that. We want freedom of information. But I think it's so much more than that. And it's also, we don't necessarily regulate open space. We don't, or access to open space. We don't regulate certain things. And I want to make sure people understand that climate change, climate justice, environmental justice isn't just about the burden of poor air, you know, or pollution. It's also about not getting those benefits of hearing the crickets, of the open space. And so those are things that aren't necessarily regulated per se. So when do you ever participate saying we want more of that? We don't have that and we want some, you know? So I think it's important. So it's a limiting definition based on probably what EPA does, which is primarily a regulatory, you know, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. So they're primarily a regulatory, and they're not necessarily a big planning agency. And some of our other agencies might do more of that. So for example, if we really want access to parks, really it's about the National Park Program, right? And those types of things. So another question that is here is like, there's obviously a lot of concerns here and a little bit of pessimism. We've, you know, like, are things ever going to change? And I think you know, when we're looking at the future, when we're looking at climate and what's happening, and there is a big movement with environmental justice. There is a big movement, you know, particularly in Connecticut with the Governor's Council on Climate Change. So maybe if somebody could think about or share any ideas of why are you optimistic or maybe not? Is there you know, are we optimistic about where we're going with this? Thoughts?
Well, if I can start, because I'm on closest to you.
And
I'm
you
not
are.
optimistic. I used to be optimistic. I remember an 18-year-old girl debating with my relatives about how my chances in the world are so much greater now with the civil rights gains. And I'm saying, you know, I'm a dark-skinned girl. I admitted into a white Ivy League school that only accepted light-skinned Black people. And I thought that, wow, I mean, my whole life is going to change. And my Uncle Bob, and sit in the corner, half asleep, but we know he was listening to the conversation. He rose up and said, not in your lifetime. And I spent my whole life trying to prove him wrong. And I really recently had to give up and say he was right. You know what he said? He said, laws don't change people. And that is so correct. You know, with all the civil rights laws about equal housing, equal accommodations, transportation, jobs, how's that been working for us? Voting Rights Act, how's that been working for? Federal laws don't change people. What changes people is right here. Sorry. You really have to think of people as humans. And we were talking at dinner when I told folks that I do my community organizing by espousing the Harriet Beecher Stowe method, because if she had not written Uncle Tom's Cabin, the world would still think of us as animals with tails. She humanized Black people. And the whole world started thinking twice about all the propaganda they had heard about us. And I do that. I bring the community to the polluters. We had a situation once where we were at a group of, at a meeting with Wheelabrator, the incinerator in Bridgeport. And I drove down from Hartford. I was very upset because I saw none of my people's cars in the parking lot. And I was mad. I can't believe I came all this far and nobody's here and they're already in Bridgeport. Well, they were inside waiting for me because they didn't need to drive. They walked to Wheelabrator because they lived on the fence line of the incinerator. And when we got inside and people started telling their stories, we saw the tears in the eyes of some of the people who didn't understand because they were on 95, got off 95, went into the building, went back, got on 95 without looking back to see 1,500 feet away people living very close to that pollution. So it's all about humanizing people. It's all about anti-racism. It's all about forgetting everything that you've heard about certain people and starting with a clean slate. Because laws don't change people.
So I have another question. What can we do in our own communities when we see, and this is in reference to the slide that's up there, when we see that we're building a school in a flood zone and that people are being displaced to build a parking lot for the airport, what can people outside of those communities do? Does anybody have any thoughts on that, particularly maybe from a planning process or a political process?
Well, the one, so Bridgeport comes to mind. I live around Hartford, so outside of Hartford, and I'm mentioning that because Bridgeport isn't my local community, but Bridgeport has some needs that come up in my mind. And I think about this often with respect to Bridgeport. How can I best support those communities? And I think it comes in a couple different ways. One is to not make my voice so loud that I can't hear the communities, even in my support of them, but also to show up and continue to mention their needs. So one of them is Remington Woods and trying to save the over 400 acre wooded property. And that is slated to become a developed property. But who's ever heard of 400 acres in a urban
setting.
context? This is kind of a modern day, like, does that happen anymore? Like, are we talking about 400 wooded acres? So I bring it up, I mention it, I bring it up to people just to make sure we're uplifting the issues that I think are important. And those that are working really hard in Bridgeport on that or other areas, I want to figure out how best to support them. So I ask, how can I best show up for you? Sometimes it might mean showing up to a meeting and standing with them. Sometimes it might mean, I don't know, at some point donating. I don't know. But listening is the biggest thing.
Yeah, and I'm going to add that I'm an environmental planner, and so folks call me, they know I'm retired, I don't work for the town anymore. And I'm on several different boards with several of the people in this room. And so people know, what my expertise is. And so I do get calls. But one of the things I've noticed is that, some of the Bridgeport, this is impacting everyone, $129 million of state funds to build a high school in a floodplain that the community doesn't want in the floodplain. So are there things you can do? It's like, there are things you can do. You can bring this up to your legislature, but I think, to Ashley's point, like, let's listen to the community. Because, even when I first was approached by the folks in New Haven, the woman who contacted me, who lives in New Haven, she's like, I wasn't sure this was a real issue. She goes, I was just kind of letting the tweed thing happen. And this is what she does. She works in New Haven and she works on issues related to New Haven. But then when you started finding out some of the details. So I think it's a matter of understanding that a lot of these decisions impact us all, and we need, and it's choices. There's consumer choices. Are we, do we fly out of Bradley, or do we go out of Tweed? There's consumer choices, but I think that there's also choices that you can make, talking within your community. There's ways that you can support the communities doing this kind of work. But I will just say this is, those are the examples because they're big and I put them out there. But you don't have to go that far. I mean, you need to, what are the issues we have here? And there are people in this room who know we have issues in this community and in adjacent communities. You don't have to go far. You're fighting the battle on we talked about air quality and like, why would we ever not have, more trees along the I-95 corridor? Why are we letting that happen? And, we have the Tree Conservancy fighting for that, but does anybody really understand that this is a huge environmental justice issue? And are we engaging everybody we need to, and basically making it about air quality instead, so that we have, so that the utilities can feel good, about trees, saying they do something for more resiliency with the electric grid instead of modernizing the grid. It's like they basically said, we're doing tree work, and that's their response, which is a non-response, right? But we need to be thinking about that. So
Just one brief comment from me. What you can do in addition to everything that everybody has said is, you're all voters. And it doesn't matter that your representative is of Bridgeport. It's a statewide matter. $129 million affects all the legislators. So you write your legislator, you call them and say, you need to not vote for this. It's the policymakers that are going to make the ultimate decision. And it's not just Bridgeport, it's the entire state.
So are we going to be wrapping up?
Well, we're actually a
Oh,
little over
time?
time.
Okay, I love.
I don't want to cut off the great conversation if you still have one.
Nope.
The party.
Yeah. We just were going to do, I was just going to wrap up with just doing
Yep.
the parting words
Yep.
and ask our panelists. We had talked about, like, is there something we can ask the audience what they can do next?
Well-
or your parting words.
Well, I want to thank Mary Lee for inviting me here and for Denise for referring me to Mary Lee and for allowing me to bring attention to the work that we do at Operation Fuel. I will say that I am a bit optimistic because of the team that I work with at Operation Fuel, who ensures that for each and every person that's calling while they're in a crisis is responding to them with kindness and a sense of urgency that they deserve. So that's what I'm optimistic about, and continuing to lead a group of folks who are just so dedicated to ensuring that everybody is helped and treated with dignity.
I'd just say, because I am a researcher, I love reading. I suggest that you all look up some Black scholarship. Scholars write about this often. And I think that will fill in some gaps for y'all, if you have any. If there are things that we haven't addressed or you're still curious about, there's a book for it, I promise you. There's a research study for it, I promise you. And contact the YWCA and I'll give you a list if you need to. Like, honestly, a Google search. But there's information out there and you can inform yourselves too. Yeah, that's it.
Well, I stole something from the biography of someone that I read about a year ago. And I'm offering up my iPad to anybody who can tell me who I'm talking about. Okay. And these are my closing thoughts. And I'm going to paraphrase this person. He said, justice will not occur until those unaffected are as outraged as those who are. Who do you think said that? Nope. Someone we all know? Nope. Nope. You're not going to believe this. I read the biography of Benjamin Franklin. And I had to like, what? I said, this is great. Let me copy this down. Justice will not occur until those unaffected are as outraged as those who are. And that is the crux to all of this. Because you see, everybody needs to be outraged. It might not be happening to you now, but it will get to you. And just because it's only happening to me, so you're safe, it's okay, you don't feel for me, you don't want to help correct things, you have to be just as outraged. That's when justice will occur.
Well, let's give them a round of applause, everyone. Really, thank you to this incredible panel. Thank you to them and to all of you for honoring Dr. Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King with us this evening. Please look for an email from us. It will contain information from tonight, slides, the resources you see on your program, and some others that we're going to add to that. And then mark your calendars for April 28th. It's a Friday at noon at Town Hall. That's our annual Stand Against Racism. We hope those of you here and those online will join us. Thank you again for being with us and have a great evening. Take care.